Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Technology, especially AI, has become the new frontier of US-China competition. While the US rolled out many policies aimed at preventing China from accessing and growing its emerging technologies, the Chinese government has also issued a series of regulatory reforms and crackdowns in recent years, which led to the private sector's retreat and the government's increasing control of technology advancement, including shifting the focus from consumer to hardcore technologies for China's bid to overtake the US in innovation. Today's guest is Angela Huyue Zhang, professor of law at the University of Southern California. Until just a few months ago, she was a professor of the University of Hong Kong. She's a leading authority on China's internet regulations, and her book, High Wire, gave a rare insight and a solid analysis of how the Chinese government leverages regulations to govern the economy and to advance its ambition for global technology leadership. So welcome, Angela.
Thank you, Wenqi, for having me.
So let's start with semiconductors, since that's the sector of most interest to Taiwan, specifically the US export controls. You recently said that you think these restrictions will fail. Tell us why.
Well, when I make the comment that I think that they are more likely to fail than to succeed, first we need to clarify what success would mean for the US, because so far, it's not entirely clear what exactly is the objective of all these U.S. Sanctions and restrictions on Chinese technology companies. For instance, in the area of semiconductor, right? I mean, if the objective is to prevent China's advancement of the military use of AI, I don't see the current strategy is working effectively towards that goal, because the military use of AI technology mostly we're talking about the legacy chips, right? I mean, which is not the primary focus of the U.S. AI chip bans, which is banning the most advanced, the smallest AI chips to China. So for a lot of the industry observers, it looks like what the U.S. is trying to do is more to slow down China's progress with the AI sector. And from a short-term perspective, it is working. And that's not surprising, because if you look at the previous pattern of U.S., whether we're talking about sanctions or restrictions, they do work temporarily if we are talking about a very short time span. However, the longer it prolongs, the more likely it will fail. It will fail for a couple of reasons. First, oftentimes these kind of sanctions and restrictions, they also inflict a cost on the U.S. companies themselves, right? I mean, for instance, the semiconductor ban have dealt a big blow to the U.S. tool makers, right? Because other allies were not prohibited from selling to the Chinese companies, whereas the U.S. tool makers were prohibited from doing so. They suffer a big market loss given how important China is, right? I mean, so despite
although the US has been able to build, it seems like a global alliance, right? So it's not just the US companies that are hurt in this process. And also, there are some US lawmakers who literally say that, so what if American companies' commercial interests are hurt, right? Because it is more important for national security, economic security, and it is time to prioritize those issues rather than, thinking about whether companies are making money. If that is the objective, right? Because there's other domestic political consideration, it sounds like today's Washington, D.C. doesn't care that much about how big companies are doing?
Well, I mean, the commercial success of the U.S. companies obviously still matter hugely for the U.S. tech innovation, right? I mean, Intel recently, cut off a huge number of staff, and it's not doing very well, right? I mean, the stock performance was suffered tremendously,
Right.
right? I mean, partly because Intel needs to retreat from the Chinese market, which account for over 30% of its own business, right? Now,
Right.
I think the U.S. got really lucky with NVIDIA thanks to the AI boom. Now let's consider the counterfactual that had NVIDIA did not had got the luck it had with the AI, the emergence of ChatGPT and the use of its CPUs for AI training. I mean, NVIDIA will be on the verge of bankruptcy if it's have to be restricted from supplying to the Chinese market.
So that's interesting. You use the word luck, right? Let's focus on NVIDIA for a minute because, Taiwanese are so proud of Jensen Huang, who has the Taiwanese background. And so he's like a rock star in Taiwan. Why do you say it's luck? Is it because of the timing? Less so about NVIDIA's sort of capabilities or innovation in terms of its current success?
Well, I mean, obviously, Jensen Huang is somebody who have earned to a large extent what he has achieved today, and through his hard work and through resilience. And he admitted, yes, NVIDIA has
about it a lot. Yes,
exactly, right. I mean, and if you may recall, a few years ago, the firm was really facing huge trouble, and its stock performance also suffer when the U.S. imposed restrictions on the semiconductor ban on China, right? I mean, so luck does play a part here because thanks to the AI boom, right? I mean, so that's what I'm saying, because if you look at the previous history of U.S. sanctions and export restrictions, and very often because the U.S. owned domestic companies have to suffer from these restrictions, and the business suffer a big loss, and in the end, it actually you allow other countries and plus China to catch up and capture the market. Right? I mean, this is something that U.S. definitely does not want to happen, right? So this is the other thing why I think this kind of sanction restriction will fail in the longer term, because U.S. is incentivizing the Chinese development and its own self-sufficiency capability. And obviously, this is not something new, right? A lot of people have been talking about it. The big question here is, how likely do we think China will succeed, right? Because the semiconductor supply chain is so complicated and involve players from so many different geographies, right? I mean, and the U.S., as you mentioned, is working very hard in trying to persuade its allies to get on board. But you see, the longer it stretches, the more doubts that allies will have about this, because the allies don't share the same objective as the U.S. government, right? I mean, the allies are less concerned about China's tech rivalry. And in fact, some of the allies want to profit from this kind of rivalry, right? And some of the allies also care deeply that if say ASML were not able to supply to China and China developed this capacity, it might in the end, allow China to take over this area of business, because China is really good at scaling its business.
Yeah. Well, I think there are certainly lots of questions about, the effectiveness of U.S. Current policy, especially that is more prohibitive type of policies. Now, we want to talk about China as well, because I think the most valuable part of your book is actually you are one of the leading and very few experts, on the international stage who can actually help the world understand what China is thinking when it comes to the technology sector as well as, it's using the regulations. So let's start maybe with China's AI regulations, because I believe they were the first in the world, right, when they issued that. So what is China thinking behind those laws and regulations?
Right, a very good question. Right, I mean, AI has a very wide application. So there are many different types of AI technology, and we observe the Chinese government adopt quite different approach in regulating its AI technology depending on its specific application. Let's take an example of the facial recognition technology, in which China has achieved a lot of commercial success, and actually has been able to produce the world's most advanced and most accurate facial recognition technology. And this is also the most widely applied technology in China, right? I mean, and
Because
this
you
is
have so many people. I mean, the population itself helps improve the data, algorithm.
Yeah, exactly. And we all know the Chinese government conducted a massive public surveillance program,
Right.
and you see camera almost everywhere in China, right? I mean, so thanks to the demand from the government and also the procurement from the government, this technology have achieved phenomenal success, right? I mean, there have been research showing that actually this kind of private and public coordination, right, in which the government procure facial recognition technology from Chinese company actually facilitate the success of this technology, because government is able to provide really tons of data to these firms to train this technology, and that's why it has become so good, right? Now, have China done much in regulating this technology? I would say very, very little. Right? I mean, does China have capacity to regulate its use? Of course, right? I mean, China is not short of legal expert, and in fact, a draft law has been a group of legal experts have been, pushing forward a draft regulation, and which they released last year in August. But to this day, we haven't seen the government adopted this comprehensive piece of legislation to bring in this technology, despite a lot of public complaints about its abusive use. I'm not talking about abusive use by the government agencies. I'm talking about abusive use in commercial settings. Like, for instance, when you enter into a lot of supermarket or mall, you see camera installed by the owners of the premise, right? I mean, which is actually should be prohibited. But there's not a lot of, it doesn't seem like a very strong view on the side of the Chinese government so far, despite a lot of the push from various interest groups to really, put a halt to this kind of commercial abusive use of this technology. And you can see, the opposition will be because the concern that this might hold back the development of this technology, might hurt the commercial prospect of these companies, right? So you can see China is taking kind of like a wait and see approach, and quite a tolerant approach with the facial recognition technology. But with regard to other types of AI services, when we are talking about recognition algorithm or deepfakes or generative AI, you see the government has been really proactive in churning out a lot of regulations, because the government, at the end of the day, the Chinese Communist Party is concerned about political alignment of this checkbox, right? I mean, this is the bottom line of the Chinese Communist Party. But at the same time, the government, just like the cover of my book, right? I mean, it is walking on high wire when it comes to regulating AI technology, because at the same time, China also wants to develop a very cutting-edge generative AI services. I also want to produce a really cool recommendation algorithm that can take over the world, like TikTok, right? I mean, so the government has to strike an extremely delicate balance in regulating this technology. So you see, despite the fact that they put a great emphasis on content moderation and censorship and information control, the other aspect of the regulation of this technology has been extremely light touch. We haven't seen any significant enforcement against any large AI firms, while you have observed, a lot of things happening in the US and the EU, but it's eerily quiet in China, right? I mean, so this is, it's not that the government lacked any law or enforcement capacity to go and discipline these companies. It's more of a view to really take very serious action against these firms.
So it's really interesting because we see similar conversations taking place in Europe as well as in the US, right? What or how should AI be regulated? And if you look at those who advocate for less AI regulation in the US in particular, they tend to use China as the justification, right? Because number one, they're saying it's hard to compete with China when you are putting all the guardrails rather than helping innovation. And then second, of course, is the competition in terms of just state control and, freedom of speech and all these other issues. So it sounds like China, I don't know if it's aware of, all the arguments or, certainly the government is, very aware of what it wants to do, at least in terms of helping AI technology advancement, right? Like it's trying to enable the innovation in the sector.
Yeah. I mean, once you totally get the intricacies of the Chinese regulatory governance, and from you, and thanks for mentioning my book. I mean, when you read it, you will realize, Chinese regulation for the most part is an enabling instrument rather than restrictive as an obstacle, right? I mean, so despite the fact that the government initiated this massive crackdown on its tech firms between 2020 and 2022, and really, dealt a huge blow to these firms. But for the rest of the time, I mean, look at the early 2010s until late 2020, the regulation has been extremely lax. I mean, because thanks to the top policy initiatives to develop the internet sector, right?
So so I do want to talk about it, right? Because to the West in particular, between 2020 and 2022, it's kind of scary to watch how much all of a sudden all these laws are being pushed out by the Chinese government. I mean, I think, a lot of lawmakers in the West, will probably be quite envious at just the pace and the speed. However, it has, as your book said, had a chilling effect on China's private sector, entrepreneurial spirit, and of course, economic growth. And your book actually, sort of explain why the Chinese government was doing that. So can you just share with our audience, help our audience understand why the Chinese government wanted to crack down on the internet sector during that time?
Right. Look, I mean, this really goes back. The book went into great length of discussing how China went about the tech crackdown in different areas of law, but most importantly, the book proposed a framework for us to think about, in general, how Chinese government governed, right? I mean, what is the model of China's regulatory governance? And as we just talked about, I mean, for a really long time, the firms and the government were in a honeymoon period where you see the government was kind of giving these firms a helping hand. Right. Even despite of mounting public complaints and tensions have been accumulating over time, right? It wasn't until crisis have loomed that the government that's threatened the bottom line of the Chinese Communist Party that the government decided to bring in these big tech firms. And obviously,
give us an example, like what has threatened, for example, the CCP's grip of its power.
Right, the direct trigger, the tipping point, as I described in my book, the direct trigger was the Ant Group's IPO, in late 2020, and then and subsequently, obviously, Jack Ma's speech also help facilitate that the trigger. Now, fundamentally, it's the Chinese Communist Party perceived the Ant Group's IPO as a threat to the financial stability of China, because this firm got a market valuation of $320 billion before its IPO. And that placed the firm at a higher valuation than JP Morgan at that time. Now, how did this 6-year-old company spin off from Alibaba achieve such a high valuation? Because Ant claimed that it is a technology company, which allowed it to get 4 times as high a valuation as a financial institution. Because Ant said, I'm just an intermediary connecting borrowers and banks. They own banks, right? I mean, I don't have any skin in the game. I don't have any interest. I'm just an intermediary. I'm just a technology company. Even in its, if you may recall, even its IPO prospectus, it's that I am a tech fin. I'm not a fintech company, and even changed its name from Ant Financial to Ant Group in order to avoid being scrutinized as a financial institution, right? So basically, if considered counterfactual, if Ant did not pitch so aggressively for such a high valuation and did not, achieve such a huge scale, I think the situation would have been very different. We might not even see this massive crackdown. It is at this point, because Ant's IPO and as well as Jack Ma's arrogant speech, that really alarmed Chinese financial regulators as well as the really top Chinese leadership. And they wake up and realize, look, I mean, this company, Taobao, is not just selling clothes or popcorns. I mean, this company is, offering financial services that can potentially control the Chinese economy. And that in turn will threaten the political stability and control of the Chinese Communist Party.
So at the end of the day, it is about controlling, right? Like, how much do they feel like they can control, of course, a very important like financial sector, or taxi, for example, Didi, right? Like, I think it is the fear of companies' monopoly as well. I mean, using the Western language, right? That would be viewed as monopoly, having too much power. And so one of the things I think, it's interesting is to compare how, let's just say the US approaches, regulations when it comes to big tech, and the Chinese government when it comes to big tech. I think there are a lot of people in the US would have liked to see big techs being regulated. It almost like the same philosophy, except that China has been able to do it because the government has so much more power. They can do it so effectively and so fast. So I guess my question is, like, do you feel that there's certain misunderstanding of what the Chinese government's actions are when it comes to regulations and technology? Because there's a lot of framing in terms of just, government crackdown, stifling the private sector, which is also true as well, right? Like, how does one who doesn't know that much about China sort of have a more objective view, I should say?
Right. I mean, I actually see a lot of the regulatory actions are long overdue. And in fact, it was partly the government's inaction that have contributed to the problem, severity of the problem we had today. Now, this is not just a phenomenon unique to the tech sector. If you look at the property sector, right, people also talk about China's property crackdown. And again, the Chinese government have perfect legitimate reasons to reform this sector, because house prices have gone through the roof, even more expensive than London and New York, and that doesn't make any sense. However, the problem is, for a really long time, they did not deal with it, and the situation have got worse and worse. And by the time now they come back to address this problem, it tends to generate huge backlash, right? So that's the kind of volatility. Now, this kind of distinct feature I analyze in my book, I propose in my book, right? And that's why, Chinese regulation tend to generate huge volatility, dramatic regulatory pendulum swing. And now look at the Chinese property sector, look at the tech sector, they all have to roll back these measures eventually because the government realized this kind of intense and heavy-handed regulatory action is actually not sustainable because
and it's hurting the economy, at least right now. I mean, we can see.
And then you are, how to say, now you try to popping a bubble, you create another pop bubble, and it's a bigger bubble, right? I mean, now it's a much bigger bubble, and the Chinese economy has suffered from various fronts at the moment. It become a bigger risk to the Chinese government and the Communist Party, and now it has to roll back all these measures, right? I mean, you see, just yesterday, the Chinese. The People's Bank have rolled out emergency measures and to trying to rescue the Chinese market, right? I mean, so the Chinese policymakers are now in a constant whack-a-mole crisis situation, right? I mean, because of its own distinct regulatory governance model. So you see, Wenjie, I'm trying to be very neutral here. I'm very critical of what the Chinese government does. I'm also very critical of the US government. And by the way, you actually found some striking parallel between the US export restrictions or US policy towards China with what China is doing. Because when it comes to things in relation to foreign relations, the US government possesses tremendous discretion. The executive branch very often is subject to very little judicial constraint or congressional constraint. And you see over time in the past few years, the executive branch power have been expanded. And that also create all sorts of problems. And this is something that I don't think have gotten a lot of attention from the media or from the academia so far. But this is something that we should look at. And you can see the parallel. And that's why I said, this kind of US policy is likely to fail because it can lead to fragile outcome as we see in the Chinese context.
It is actually some US scholars have argued that and even use that as a way to try to dissuade the US government from doing too much, right? They're saying, well, why is the US copying the Chinese model, right? It's almost like the two sides are competing to behave in a way that is not beneficial to the market. And so it's a little bit of race to the bottom, I think, for some people. And then you certainly see like the two governments also learn from each other, right? The data privacy issue, the data security issue, how to restrict data from sharing outside of their territory. All these things seem to be, they're just copying each other, which I'm not sure, I think from certain people's point of view, it's harmful to innovation. We have limited time, but there's so much I want to talk about. But can I just ask you, if you had the opportunity to speak to President Xi directly and giving him advice, what would you say to him? Of course, in the context of technology. Likewise, what would you say to the next president of the United States when it comes to technology advancement?
Well, technology is definitely at the epicenter of the US-China rivalry at the moment. But I hope both the presidents from both sides can come to realize there is something of greater significance than the geopolitical rivalry, which is our global safety and prosperity, right? I mean, if we in the future need to be concerned about the existential risk from AI, for instance, I think it makes perfect sense for the two greatest superpowers to cooperate on various fronts. Although currently, the rivalry has made it extremely impossible and infeasible at the moment. But I think both sides should closely monitor AI risks and consider the greater good for the humanity.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for anyone who wants to really get a better understanding beyond sort of the news headlines about China's internet sector. I would strongly encourage you to read Professor Zhang's book, which really is a pretty balanced approach to helping the world understand how Chinese government leverages regulations in terms of enabling its technology sector. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope to have you back next time, and take care.
Thank you, Wenqi. Bye.